hopeful to be here, but he had a family funeral to attend and didn't make it back, and that's his coach. So I know he would have been here if he could have.
All right, I want to thank all of you for coming to help with Wade's presentation. I think everybody has an evaluation sheet, reminder that Mrs. Todd and I, we evaluate the project and so forth, but feedback that students get, not only your written feedback, but also there's filming of this. It's more than just an exercise, it's a learning opportunity, presentation skills and all. So Wade, you introduce your project and your charge.
Absolutely. Thank you everyone for coming out today to support me as I get ready to graduate and finish up some of the capstone projects for the department. So every senior is required to do some form of senior project. This usually takes the form of either a 40-hour, 80-hour, 120-hour project. I chose to do a 40-hour database project on behalf of my church back home. So a little backstory on it. My church back home is roughly 30 people in a 180-year-old building, and it has a graveyard of about 800 people. So more deceased than attending members. The issue it has is, since it dates back so far, a lot of the graves are pioneer graves. So if there was a stone, it's just a little cement block in the ground with the name and date on it. The issue we ran into is kind of keeping up on these records. The sexton of the church, which is the person kind of in charge of the bookkeeping of the graveyard, approached me wanting a way to kind of digitize these records and get them onto a queryable database for their record keeping. The most recent kind of digital version of the data that we have is an Excel spreadsheet from 2013 when the Des Moines County surveyors went through and kind of surveyed the graveyard. Prior to that, any existing records exist there's 4 leather-bound books that are about that thick and smell like dust. All the plots and stuff is hand-drawn inside them. So we needed a way to kind of get this into the modern age. So I came up with a project to create a database, a relational database, to set up tables that all these data points can be entered into, and that the sexton can query them as they need to. So some of the objectives for this project, I wanted to create a database, use the 2013 survey as kind of the backbone for my data entry, and then allow users to download query results. It doesn't do a whole lot of good if you can query the page and then it just sits there in the browser and you can't do anything with it. 3 of the main skills that this project trains are full stack development, because I am creating the web page environment as well as the back end, which interacts with the database. Database design, which is very important when it comes to querying and creating functional structures. Databases are very temperamental, and we need to make sure that things are done as close to perfectly as possible. And then SQL manipulation. SQL is a server query language that allows users to kind of sort through and parse out all the records so they can pull back what they want and admit what they don't. So every web server needs to have a home. Predominantly in business environments, either the server is a dedicated server that you connect to the network, or you pay somebody a monthly fee to kind of lease a portion of their web resources to set up your own server. I chose to use XAMPP, which allows you to take a standalone machine and make it its own web server. This was ideal for my church's environment because being a 180-year-old building in the middle of nowhere, there's no internet around. There's hardly any cell service. So trying to set up a web-based connection is kind of a fool's errand there. So the local server, we would use Apache web server. It would have MySQL functionality, and then it would manage the backend stuff through PHP-MyAdmin, which is a wonderful portal for using the PHP language. The dashboard itself with PHP-MyAdmin makes it very easy to create your database structure inside tables, that kind of stuff. You simply select new, enter the name you want. In this case, I use Shiner Cemetery after the church. You press create, bam, your database spins itself up. There's nothing in it. You'll need to go in and create tables, and columns, and configure them. Which brings me to the next point. Relational databases are special because they use structures called relationship keys to sort items. My database uses 3 main tables. It has one for the plot, which the cemetery has 4 plots. Plots are kind of the larger bodies of graves. lots, which each plot has between 30 at the smallest and 100 lots at the largest. And then graves. Typically there's 4 graves per lot. So if you have a plot of 100 graves, there's going to be roughly 400 grave sites. But relational databases are nice because they reduce the amount of information required for each record. We'll see this on, just go to the next page, see it. So here's my 3 tables. The center one is kind of the bread and butter. This is the grave. This records the name, birth date, death date of the individual buried there. It also contains, so if you look at that green line, you can see that it goes from lot number on the grave table to lot number on the lot table. That lot table contains information that corresponds to what lot the grave is located in, as well as the geographic location relative to the church. So each lot is broken up into rows and columns. This helps with, or having that information helps when it comes to finding, say, all the veteran graves. I can query the database and pull out a list that contains all of the graves belonging to veterans, as well as where they're located at in the plot. Prior to this, we had, the handwritten list of, find this grave, it should be in this plot, and you'd be walking around for days looking for little stones in the ground. With this, it kind of tells you where you need to be looking. SQL queries can use these relationship keys to pull data from multiple tables. That way you don't have to have one monstrous table, which would be 20 columns. A lot of the columns are redundant. If you have the lot number, you can automatically pull the column and row. So you kind of save yourself some processing power and carpal tunnels from entering everything. Each record represents a single entry in the database. So again, 4 plots, a total of 326 lots, which if they follow the what is now considered the legal constraint as far as how many bodies you can have in a lot, which was 4, you should have 1,304 graves. But there, some graves or some lots are a little different because back in the pioneer days, if you paid for the lot, you're going to use the whole lot. We've got a couple 4-person lots that have 8 people in them, which makes it fun when you're going through and trying to sort everything and you have more people than you should in a given area. The major constraint that I had to jump through from the data perspective was using the survey that the county surveyors had drummed up for the cemetery back in 2013. A lot of this data was, hand punched in by a clerk, which led to a lot of inconsistencies. In part because of the way things were entered, all the numbers came through as strings. If you try to upload a string into a database that expects an integer, it really doesn't like it, and it kind of stops at that point. The biggest issue that I had overcome was not everything, was known. In the birth date, you'll see those first few, it has just the year. Back in the day, you paid by the letter on the stone, and that could get expensive, so you just threw the important stuff on there. This creates a problem with databases if you try to do any date-based functions, because if you have it look for a date, it's going to expect your day, your month, and your year. If you have it look for just an integer function, it's not going to like the ones that it view this one as having 6 characters because you have 2 for the date, 2 for the month, 4 for the year, 8 characters. So the way I got around that is if you look on the next page, this is kind of the printout for my grave tables. I have birth month, birth day, and birth year. I went through and I ran Excel magic functions to kind of parse out the date, the day, the month, and the year for each of the dates that I knew. Ones that I don't know, like you can see in these spaces, they're set to null. And when the grave, or when that's uploaded to my table, it fills those in with 0 so that it can still perform its date-based calculations. They just won't have any interaction. Another important thing on the surveys was the notes column. The notes is the gravekeeper entered in some notes, whether it's relationships with these people. But the most important one is like this 3rd row up from the bottom. It lists kind of the rank and where this member served. Twice a year, we put out flags at the cemetery, and we need a way to find these veteran graves. So I created a column. It's either 0 for no, 1 for yes, if this member a veteran. And I was able to go through and look at our list of veterans that we used when we walked the cemetery, as well as what was compiled in the survey to kind of determine, yes, this member was a veteran, no, this member wasn't, which then creates a queryable field that I can pull all the veterans out of. SQL is kind of the back-end bread and butter for servers. Pull your records, find your magic. SQL statements generally have 3 components. They can have more depending on how you want to splice things together, but in general, you can do most things with just these basic 3. You have your select, your from, and your where. Your selects what you're looking for. You want grave numbers, column numbers, that kind of stuff. Your from is what table and database you're pulling it from, and where is kind of a criteria. Where plot equals 1, so you pull your graves from plot 1. In the select statement, you can use case, which is, so if, the biggest example of the case statement was with date. I had 3 possible combinations that date could be. Either it would be just the year value and the month, the day would need to be omitted, or you could have month and year, or you could have day, month, year. It could look at this and then use the concat function. If it had all 3, it could run it together and convert it to a date, so then the database function can spreadsheet would function. The from allows you to select where you want it from, which predominantly is the grave table. That's kind of the main nexus. The join lets that merge on relationships with your tables. So for instance, in the grave table, I have the lot number key, which corresponds with the lot number in the lot table to pull the row and column information. And here's one of the SQL queries that I use. Up top, you can see I want the plot number, lot number, grave number, name information, as well as the row and column information. I want it from the grave table, and I want to make sure it's a highlighted relationship to join it to lot on lot number. And then for my where table, I want it to be where lot number is equal to plot number, and that plot number is equal to 1. This filters out any unwanted entries, so I'm not going to see anything from plot 2, or 3, or 4, or where plot numbers doesn't exist through a relationship error. It's going to find only the ones that I want it to find. And this is what the query result looks like for this table. It'll pull up, there's my where key, which is plot number equals 1. I have my lots, what grave number they are. So down here I've got 4 6s, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 6s, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then what name, the name of the individual buried there, and what row and column they are relative to the physical location of the plot. So PHP allows communication between the web pages and the server. It can handle the SQL queries. I've learned that you can embed anything with PHP. PHP can embed HTML in your web page, so rather than actually having an HTML page with PHP, you have a PHP page with HTML inside of it. So this is kind of an example of what the PHP structure looks like. Every one of my pages begins with this because the config.php holds the connection keys so that it can connect to the database on the local host. If something happens with this, or I can't find this, nothing's going to work. This is an example of the embedded query. It's very similar to the one previously explained. But you have your PHP block, your $ query variable. All the PHP variables use $, that kind of separates them out from any SQL or HTML variables that you're trying to use. And then at the end, you have it return the result for the query, which is then built into this table. Actually, the table is the next step. This binds what it returns from each row. So for instance, the column num variable is going to lock on to a given row where it then grab the data that is returned as column. This array at the bottom then prints out that data into an HTML table, and then goes on to the next row, and keeps going until it finds no more rows to copy over. That's the HTML with PHP embedded in it too. And the echo command is what is used to create these HTML commands inside PHP. So this one is actually an HTML block with embedded PHP embedding HTML. And what that does is it creates your table, fills it with names, orders it, and then there's some CSS files that come along and straighten it up, make it look nice. And the serialize command is used to actually write this file to a downloadable file so that you can download the query. And you have the download path, export. So this query was for lots available. This is any non-occupied lot. It writes it to a CSV file, grabbing the serialized data from the PHP export, and then downloads it to your downloads folder. This is an example of what the user would download. It's going to show grave status 0, which means that the grave is empty, and then what plots, lots, and the row and column information for these graves. That is the conclusion of the presentation portion. I'm now going to question and answer, and then if time allows, I also have a live version of these graves.
You mentioned that the survey from 2013 was the backbone. Did you add additional data, or was all of your data in that original Excel spreadsheet?
All of the data for this is from the original, or all of the data from this is from the 2013 survey. I do not have in my possession more recent records yet.
So that, you intend to use this in your church?
Yes.
And so you'll add those
Yep.
later?
So Wade, how, when you set this up, I recognize it's for the use in this church and for, essentially, I think you said you're responsible for kind of overseeing this information. Is this something that you think will be, or is it going to be available to other people who might be doing like searches on family history? Do they need to go to the church to get this information?
They would be able to. The information as far as, like automatically linking these family members is going to be sparse, but if they have a name that they're looking for, they'll be able to find the online version of the records.
I'm not sure I heard the question. Were you asking if they could find them online, or were you saying would they have to go to church to do the work?
Yeah, can they go online, or do they go through your source?
They would have to physically go to the church.
Go to the church.
Because the church doesn't have access to
Right,
it.
I know you said that there was.
Do you know if they have plans on those?
As far as like putting records available for online access, no.
Do you have two questions? One, is there a good way for a novice to enter data into your database? And then I'll have to think about what I was going to ask the other one. I'll come back to it. You answer that one first.
Yes. So if I pull up the live version, you can interact directly with the web interface. So this is what the home directory looks like. It pulls up the basic table. You could theoretically go through here and edit and look for and edit information. But if you use the Create New Record feature, it creates basically an exact copy of what the database is looking for on the import. You can select the plot number, grave number of the new entry, enter name and birth date information, as well as notes and then contact info in case, like in a future event, the grave stone either falls over or gets damaged by a lawnmower. You know who we can contact to go about that repairs.
So this is what your user or the person managing your records will see.
Yep.
They will not have to see the back end. Who's
Do you
gonna?
have required fields on that?
Yes, it will throw an error. For instance, if you don't enter a lot number or anything that it looks for as a foreign key, it'll throw in a lot of the critical fields that either accept a 1 or a 0. I think it's a drop-down list. So for the lot number,
Could you add a record right now while you're talking
Yes.
about that?
so it's like plot 1, grade 1, keep it near the top of the list. We'll put Joshua next. What is this? He always calls me for everything, so I can go in his contact information. And finals got it.
Oh, finals got it.
See record to save. Yeah, there he is. Joshua.
And then you're able to delete him if you made an error.
Yep, I can actually edit and delete. So I can go in here and it'll bring up his file, all the information that I've entered, and go through and change what I'd like to. Or I can simply select delete. Yeah, he's removed from the database.
Now that looks like it's online though.
Yep, it's just a local web server. It would look like a functional web page. I could put this on like our low node server, for example, and it would function. But it's all conducted in-house. I don't know if you can see it here, but the URL, if you go up there, all it says is localhost and then slash the address of this page in the file system.
So the user will feel like they're on the web, but not really.
Yep. Which does save you some on the security thing. You don't have to worry about somebody getting into your server and using it for their own ends.
Do you have a backup plan for this? Computers fail. Your sexton is at work at church and the computer crashes. What will you do?
Put it in multiple places. Ideally, keep a version of, or an instance of it saved on a flash drive. Now, the nice thing with the PHPMyAdmin, you can go in there and you can export the entire database structure, including all the files that are inside, into a single SQL document. That's all you need to build the database, and usually under 10 seconds.
Do you have instructions for that for your sexton on how to do that kind of thing?
Yep. The basic construction portion is walked through in the technical paper, as well as there's a README.
A README file?
Yep.
Okay.
Have you considered making a graphical interface for the plots?
Yes, originally I had wanted to create kind of a simple grid map that could organize them by row and column, but as time allowed, that was going to be a much more demanding task than I was prepared to do.
How many hours were you required to work on this?
It's required to work 40, and I documented 55. Close to 55. Plus or minus.
Has the sexton tried to?
No, the sexton's not saying that. But I have some emails from them based on, this is the kind of query and style that they want to find, and I was able to take what they wanted and turn that into some of the queries. If you go to the veterans page, there again is that veterans table. It's going to list all the veteran members in the cemetery, on and on and on. It has exportability. It can be exported as a CSS file, which can then be processed further using reporting software.
What was the most surprising thing you learned in the project?
Just how difficult it is to separate strings into coherent integers. It took me a good 3 hours of hitting my head against the wall to figure out, how to overcome that issue with some dates not existing, and some being in different formats, some being typed in. Being able to kind of boil it all down to something that was usable to the database. Because databases have to have a degree of consistency. You can't have dates presented in different formats. It's not going to like it.
What do you think about requiring a senior project from every senior? You think this was a good experience for you?
I think it was. There comes a certain point where you need to be given free rein on a project to really kind of test your mettle. Make sure that you can take on a project and deliver a sufficient result on it.
Did you learn anything about yourself during this process?
Yes.
What'd you ask her?
Sleep is optional. It was interesting to go back and start learning I don't want to say relearning, but kind of refamiliarizing with all the HTML structures that we learned in web design and then the PHP from web development. Just those little things that you don't think you'll remember about it, they really come back to help you, especially with the logical foundation. If you can think out the logic of something, you can get through it 9 times out of 10, eventually.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, thank you guys for coming out. We really appreciate the support. Thanks for coming to my presentation.
I thought you told me you had an unofficial sponsor for this today.
Yeah, Nathan would be upset if I didn't.
Where is it?
Nathan's taking a test.
Oh, we don't see anything.
Oh.
Oh, now we do.
There it goes. Yeah. We have what's referred to as Wade's wall. On my desk, there's a wall of the 14 cans of Bang that I've gone through in the last 2 weeks.
That's good.
We opened the window the other day and the breeze kicked up and out blew over.
No.
14 and 2 weeks, only one a day.
Self-discipline, that's what you call that. Well, thank you for coming. Thank you, Wade, for presenting. We'd love to have your feedback on the forms.
Just
Please.
leave it, if you will, where
It
you
should
are.
be a
and I'll run around
two-page,
and pick
it
it
should
up.
be a two-page form, either front and back or 2 pages. So if you give that a shot, that'd be great.